Diabetes Connections is brought to you by the OneTouch brand, providing diabetes management solutions for people living with diabetes, including the OneTouch Vario Flex blood glucose meter and the OneTouch Reveal mobile app. Taking a step forward starts with seeing where you are. And by Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes with the world's first continuous glucose monitoring system that sends glucose readings directly to your compatible smart device. Live life on your own terms with Dexcom. Hey, it's Stacey. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, the flash glucose monitoring system, the Freestyle Libre, is approved in the U.S. We'll talk about what that means, what the system does, and its partnership with Bigfoot Biomedical. An interview with CEO Jeffrey Brewer about what this partnership means and what's on the horizon.
We're not a pump company. We're not a pen company. We're not a CGM company. We're a solutions company.
We'll talk about what Bigfoot hopes to accomplish with this new partnership, the company's timeline, and Jeffrey Brewer's very personal story. And we're talking to Steve Hanley. He is the founder of No Foods. That's KNOW. I tracked down Steve after a big act of philanthropy this summer, and he talks about what makes No Foods different.
You're not speaking to someone who's going to tell you about meat made in a lab or cricket insect powder protein bars or vegan cheese. I mean, I don't even know what that is. Vegan cheese, right? In any case, instead, I think this is pretty mainstream.
And a little bit about kids with type 1, okay, my kid with type 1, and field trips. It all starts now on Diabetes Connections. Welcome. I am so glad that you're here. We have so much to talk about today. Lots going on. Diabetes Connections, if you're new to the show, is where we aim to educate and inspire about type 1 diabetes by sharing stories of connections, talking to athletes and celebrities, newsmakers, authors in our community, as well as the healthcare companies and the tech folks who keep trying to push us forward. And, of course, the everyday people who live with type 1 or are touched by diabetes in some way. I put myself firmly in that category. My son has type 1 diabetes. He was diagnosed just before he turned 2, almost 11 years ago now. My husband has type 2 diabetes. I do not. My broadcast background is kind of what brought me to the podcast, and here we go. Listen, before we get started this week, because I know you're here, do you want to hear all about Bigfoot and Abbott and, No Foods? What the heck is that all about? I do want to take a second and talk a little bit about Animas. You've heard the change in sponsorship at the top. Look, if you've listened for a long time, I am open and honest with you. This show is for you. I want to put you first, and that means, talking about everything that's going on. We have switched the partnership over to OneTouch. I did not have a lot of advanced knowledge about that. We had some behind the scenes conversations, mostly about what ifs, because listen, this was frankly, this was a year-long sponsorship, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen. They couldn't tell me anything they couldn't talk about publicly. I did not have any inside information. So when this all happened, they said, how about this? We switched to OneTouch. We use their products. We love their products. Many, many people who are working with Animas or who have been working with Animas are now working with OneTouch. So I'll keep you posted on how that goes. It is still part of Johnson & Johnson, and it is still a product that I use and believe in. And I should also say, I will link up again the information from Animas. If you have not been contacted by them directly yet, I did talk to them because, other than the sponsorship email, I didn't get contacted as a customer, and I was kind of complaining about that, I'll be honest. And they indicated that it was something to do with the regulations. It has to go through the mail. So they put up the website, and I will link up that page again in the show notes so you can see all the information about your warranty. And, you got, at least most of us have 2 years before this really becomes an issue, but check that and you will receive something in the mail. I don't really know why that is. I can't imagine in this day and age, but it's just one of those FDA things, I believe. And that's what Animas told me. So you should be getting something in the mail. To that end, I wanted to share with you that we have begun using the T-Slim X2 insulin pump. This is from Tandem. And we had been talking about this on and off with our endocrinologist for quite a while because Benny, as he has gotten older and, has hit puberty, his insulin needs have gone way up to the point where we just needed a bigger cartridge. If you're not familiar, the different pumps and different systems have different fill levels. So the Animas cartridge holds 200 units. The T-Slim holds 300 units. There's a T-Slim Flex that holds 500 units. So different, that's one of the things you want to ask about. And I know some of you have young children are clutching your pearls and going, what? We wouldn't use 300 units in, a month. Well, I was there, sister, and I am not there anymore. Benny's basal rates we started with the Animas because they were 0.025. And it was so accurate, so precise. We needed that when he was 27 pounds and 2 years old. But times have changed. I don't want to go to too much detail. Everybody's insulin needs are different. No matter your size, you can be a bigger person and need less insulin than someone slender who has different needs. So that's a talk to your endo kind of thing. But I did want to let you know that we have switched to the T-Slim X2, and I will keep you posted. I want to make sure it works for us. More importantly, I want to make sure it works for Benny. So I'll keep you posted. So far, so good. It certainly has done what we asked it to do, which is give us more insulin in the cartridge. I love the interface. I miss that remote. Oh, I don't understand why every pump can't be controlled by a remote meter and by the pump itself. Because sometimes you want the remote and sometimes you want the pump, right? On that Omnipod, man, how come you can't just press a button on the pod and get a unit? If I was designing a pump, well, that's a different show, but I have a lot of specs I would put into all these different pumps. So if I win the lottery, I'll let you know what I put in my pump. But listen, a lot of information there. I'll keep you posted. Just wanted to keep it all in the up and up. And if you have any questions, Stacey at diabetes-connections.com. Easiest way to reach me. If you have the app, I'll put in a plug for the app. If you have the Diabetes Connections app, you can actually contact me directly through the app. It's really easy. And that's the best way, I think, to take the show on the road if you want to listen to it in your car while you're walking the dog. The majority of people do listen to the show on Facebook, which I think is fascinating. I don't listen to podcasts on Facebook, but if it's where it works for you, fantastic. Listen wherever you want. But if you do want to get the app and contact me more easily, wherever you get any other app, it's just Diabetes Connections. Okay, well, let's get to it. Let's talk about OneTouch. OneTouch has been a trusted brand in blood glucose management for more than 30 years. This year, U.S. News & World Report named OneTouch the #1 pharmacist recommended in blood glucose monitoring devices and Lancets based on a survey of pharmacists nationwide. Find out more about OneTouch brand products at diabetes-connections.com and click on the OneTouch logo. I mentioned at the top of the show in that little teaser that I wanted to talk about field trips. So I'm always reluctant to share too much personal stuff because we all do this differently. And I think I'm a bit of an outlier in how much I let Benny do on his own. So if you think I'm crazy, you can let me know. It's fine with me. So Benny had a 3-day field trip at his school. Every grade, 4th grade and up, goes on a 3-day field trip in the fall. They all go to different places. So this year, the kids went to Charleston. The 7th grade goes to Charleston, South Carolina. We live in the Charlotte, North Carolina area. It's a great trip. If you've never been to that city, there's so much history. And they did everything. I think he came home and slept for a day and a half. It was nonstop. They were going to a military area. They were going on the USS Yorktown. They were doing an aquarium trip. They were taking a boat ride and looking at dolphins. And it was really neat to see how much they learned in just these 3 days. But of course, with diabetes, this was not a trip that parents go on. It was just hey, we're going to go. We've got school chaperones. It's a very small school. We have switched schools in the last year. This is a tiny school, so they didn't need any more chaperones. But of course, there isn't somebody who's versed in diabetes, and the nurse doesn't go on these trips. So I went to school to have a meeting about it. And somebody on the way in, it wasn't anybody who was really in the know. I said, I'm here for, field trip, talking to the middle school principal. And she said, if you just, medication, the nurse has a master list of all the medication everybody needs and you don't need to worry about anything else. And I was like, Don't you wish? Right here. He's on insulin. Bye. But of course, we can't do that. So I went and I talked to the middle school director, and he has a child who has food allergies, like severe food allergies, needs the EpiPen sort of allergies if comes in contact. And obviously they're not the same, but that's helpful to me because I know right away he understands the balance of this is an emergency. This is something to be cautious about. Because I don't know about you, but a lot of times when I talk to people, their eyes go wide and they're thinking, I'm going to be calling 911 every second. They just don't understand the difference between pay attention, treat, watch out, and emergency. And I knew he got it right away. So I won't go through every step of the way, but this wasn't our first field trip. If you listen to the show a lot, I may have talked about this in the past. In 5th grade, Benny went on a 3-day trip to Washington, D.C. with the 5th grade class. Much bigger class. Parents go, one parent for every 3 or 4 kids. My husband was supposed to go on that trip, but he had a new job he had recently. There was an out-of-town trip for him, and it just wasn't going to work out. So we sent Benny anyway. And, the Dexcom helps an awful lot. But we also had grown-ups who paid attention. It worked out great. There was one bad low at night that Benny treated himself. I texted him. He was already on top of it. There was one bad high where he felt his inset wasn't really working that great. So I FaceTimed him through an injection. Now he does them all himself, no issue. But back then he was a little nervous about it. It was fine. And that was it. It was great. The funny thing about this trip is the same exact thing happened. One bad low, one bad high. The low happened on the USS Yorktown, which is a military museum now. So I could see that he was heading down. I texted the chaperone and said, hey, you might just want to keep an eye on him if it continues. And by the time it did hit that 55 and it's blaring at everybody, they were already treating. They way over-treated, but that's just the way it goes. I don't know about your kid, but if my kid can get away with eating a little bit more, he's going to do it every time. And then there was one high, but it worked out really well. It was just a mistimed bolus for some serious junk food. I still haven't asked what it was. And you know what? I don't need to know. So I'm telling you all this, and I know you want to get to the Bigfoot, you want to get to the Abbott and Libre. If you're a parent of a child with type 1 and you're worried about sending them on these trips, look, you know your child. You know their level of responsibility. You know the chaperones around them. I just want to let you know that they can do it. The kids can do it. They really can. Look, again, this is something that you need to figure out for yourself. You need to talk to the chaperones. We all have those chaperones where we're thinking, no way am I leaving my kid. Or this person thinks that, sugar-free candy and 1 check a day is going to do it. I get it. But if you're holding back because of your worries, please rethink that. I worry every second. I always do, after the trip, I always go back in and say, what could we have done to make this better? How could we have helped out more? Or, what can I pack next time? And what can I do to make your life easier? And the chaperones always say the same thing, like, oh, I hope you didn't worry too much, or everything was great. You don't have to worry. And, you never stop worrying. You never stop worrying, but you have to send them anyway if you possibly can. Okay, so that's my soapbox, which leads me into the Dexcom spot. Here, I want to tell you about Dexcom because I am trying to raise my kids with independence, confidence, and responsibility. So I was pleasantly surprised to find out a couple of years ago using the share function of the Dexcom system helps with that. Using the separate Dexcom Follow app, we can help Benny manage diabetes in real time, at school, at a friend's, at a sleepover, or an overnight school field trip. And that gives us peace of mind and helps him feel like diabetes isn't holding him back. It's huge. With the Dexcom G5 mobile CGM system, dynamic glucose data can be accessed and shared safely and conveniently anywhere, anytime to your compatible smart device as long as there is an internet connection. The Dexcom G5 mobile is the only CGM approved for adults and children ages 2 and older with diabetes. Do not make treatment decisions based upon share and follow readings. Always confirm with your compatible smart device or Dexcom receiver. For more information, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. We are talking today quite a bit about Abbott's Freestyle Libre flash glucose monitoring system. This was very recently approved in the U.S. This recording is in mid-October. It was approved in late September of 2017. It does not need fingerstick calibration. It reads glucose levels through a sensor. It is worn on the back of the upper arm for up to 10 days with a hard stop. We will talk about exactly how it works, who it's for, and all of that with my first guest this week, and that is Dr. Chris Thomas. He is a research fellow and director of biosensor technology in Abbott's diabetes care business, and he has dedicated his career to this. For more than a decade, he has worked to develop wearable technology-based products. As you'll hear him say, the Libre system really is his life's work. Chris, thanks so much for making time for me. I know you must be really busy lately. A lot of good news and a lot of great stuff coming out these days. Thanks for making the time.
My pleasure. We're really excited to talk about the Freestyle Libre system.
All right, let's just go with the very basics here. Tell me what this is and how it differs from continuous glucose monitoring.
Well, I think to start from the beginning, really, diabetes is this frustrating combination of a silent disease and a noisy disease in that, you know, when you're hot or you're cold, you can take off a piece of clothing, you can put on a blanket. Diabetes doesn't give you that information. You don't know when your blood glucose is high or it's low. And so it's silently doing its damage without you able to know anything about it. And it's noisy because your doctor's asking you to finger prick 4 times a day, 6 times a day, 8 times a day before every meal. It's a time when you're meeting with people, when it's not discreet. And it has all this cognitive burden to it, diabetes does, where you've got to pay attention to, have I finger pricked? What's my glucose level? What am I going to eat? How much insulin do I have on board? What's the bolus? What's my basal level? All that's picking up thoughts in your mind that you could be putting to better purpose. And we knew at Abbott that there's a better way, and we know that we can empower people to live better lives through the power of health. And that's why we invented the Freestyle Libre system. And with Freestyle Libre, what we've done is we've eliminated routine finger sticks for people to understand their glucose levels. And with a quick 1-second scan of the sensor on the back of your arm, you can get your current glucose, you can get the direction that it's going in, and you can get 8 hours worth of history every 15 minutes. So you get your full glycemic picture. When you say eliminating the finger sticks, that to me just seems, after doing this with my son for more than 10 years, and even with my husband who has type 2 and checks every day, sometimes more than once a day, it just seems so odd. Tell us about the confidence that you all have in this kind of, I guess what they call factory calibration. To make a sensor that's factory calibrated, you've got to do 3 things that no one else has been able to do. You've got to make a sensor that is the same within a lot. You've got to make a sensor that doesn't drift, and you've got to make a sensor that has great stability. And through our wired enzyme technology, we've been able to do all of those 3 things. And on top of that, through our wired enzyme technology, we've been able to eliminate acetaminophen interference. So when people are taking Tylenol, for instance, the sensor doesn't read high. And so there's no other sensor on the market that's able to do all of those things. You've got to be able to have these sensors the same within a lot in order to eliminate finger sticks. And we're the only system on the market that's able to do that. Chris, back up for a second, if you could. Talk to me about the wired enzyme. What is that? What does that actually mean? Yeah, wired enzyme is the technology that the Freestyle Libre system uses that no other sensor uses. And what that does is it enables us to have a sensor that doesn't need finger sticks to calibrate. It enables us to have a sensor that is the same within a lot. It's stable on the shelf. It doesn't drift. And it doesn't have any acetaminophen interference as well, like other sensors have. But does that, listen, you tell me what you can tell me. But when you say wired enzyme, I'm thinking of like an enzyme is being released through a wire. Is that a technical word for how it works? Well, what wired enzyme is that we take glucose oxidase as part of the sensor core technology that we've got, and we shuttle the electrons that come off of the enzyme, and we wire those to the electrodes. And no other sensor works this way. And what it does is it enables all of these key features that factory calibration and the lack of acetaminophen interference. And this is what really makes the Freestyle Libre system eliminate finger sticks for people. All right, so that's where you have your PhD and I'm a podcaster. So this is where you start to lose me on how it works. But that's really interesting. I didn't realize there were different ways for the monitors, the different brands and different methods to read the interstitial fluid. That's pretty much what you're talking about, right? Where the wire is dangling under our skin. That's exactly right. It's a filament that's under the skin, and that's it's 3 human hairs wide. And this is what we do at Abbott, is we make this technology that's complicated, and we make it accessible, and we make it affordable for people. And we've eliminated finger sticks routinely. And what we found is that when people wear this, and we have 3 key studies that we've done. We've done studies in people with type 1 diabetes, people with type 2 diabetes, and we've got real-world evidence as well. where people are wearing sensors and they're going about their daily lives. And in all of these cases, people reduce their time spent in hypoglycemia by between 38% and 50%. And so for the 30 million Americans that have diabetes or have prediabetes or have situations where their glucose isn't under control, this is a system that really helps people understand what their glycemic levels are.
Yeah, I could see this being, and we'll talk more about how it would work in people with type 1, certainly. But I could see this being a real boon for people with type 2 diabetes who are, there are so many people who are nervous about pricking their fingers or they don't want to do it. And then their care suffers because of that. This could be a system where they would put it in and then you can just scan it, once or twice a day as you want it. Can you share? Is this something that you're going after for the type 2 market? As you said, 30 million, that's more than type 1.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Right now, it's available for people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes. In Europe, it's available for gestational diabetes, for pediatrics, for kids. And so we'll add those claims later to the states here. But right now, if you've got insulin as a tool to move your glucose levels up and down, this is the best way to understand your glucose levels as a way to inform what you need to do to change your insulin dosing, for whether you've got type 1 or type 2 diabetes.
All right, so with the type 2 market, and again, my bias is that I'm a mom of a kid with type 1. We did not use any kind of continuous glucose monitoring system until he was 9 because, to my feeling, it wasn't accurate enough. It wasn't on the market when he was diagnosed. But I love the Dexcom, and now I'm so used to the alerts, especially overnight. A lot of my listeners would question, why doesn't this have an alarm on it? Is that something that you didn't want or something you're working on?
Well, some people like alarms. I think many more people don't like alarms. I've lived in a country where I've been able to use the sensor, and every time you've got an alarm, you've got to set it to alarm at a higher glucose level than what you're trying to detect. And so that results in false alarms. And so false alarms are annoying to everyone. And so Libre doesn't have those issues with it. It doesn't annoy your spouse. It doesn't annoy your partner while they're sleeping as well. And then what we found in our studies, both the real-world studies and our clinical studies, is that even without alarms, we reduce the time spent in hypoglycemia even during the night. And so what Libre does is it allows you to understand your glycemic picture enough so that as you go to bed, you're able to adjust your insulin regime, understand what foods you've eaten enough so that you can reduce time spent in hypoglycemia even without the alarms. So we don't think we've given up anything with that.
Wow, that's great. Do you have diabetes yourself?
I don't, but it's personal to me. My father-in-law is a pancreatic cancer survivor. It's 8 years this week.
Wow.
And as we were developing this product, he underwent a Whipple procedure, which takes out most of your pancreas. And so that results in diabetes for most people. And so we were developing the product at the time. And so what happens is that when it's personal to most of us, including myself, and so every radius, every texture, every color in the Freestyle Libre system is something that we've developed, we've designed in, because this is such a personal system for us and for people that we love.
So you've worn it. Okay, so tell me about insertion and comfort and that kind of stuff. I mean, I don't expect you to tell me that it hurts or anything, but what's that like? It's kind of an automatic insert, right?
Yeah, and just like the sensor, right? The sensor is something that you wear on the back of your arm for 10 days at a time. So this isn't a medical device in the sense that it's used by your doctor. It's a wearable device that's intimate and it's personal to us, and we've carefully designed it so that it blends in seamlessly to your life. And so it provides this critical information for you, but it also recedes into the back of your mind when you don't want it to be there. And the insertion process is the same, really. You use an applicator. It has sensors of filament 3 human hairs wide. It goes 5 millimeters under your skin. And you put it on the back of your arm in a place where you've got very few nerve endings. So the process of applying the sensor is less painful in every person we've asked than a finger stick. Once you've applied it, which you do only every 10 days, you can then get your glucose levels anytime you want. And what we find when we do our real-world studies is that people are checking this about 15 times a day. So they're getting much, much richer glycemic information than they could ever get from finger stick. To do a finger stick 15 times a day would make you feel like a human pincushion, and nobody wants that.
And remind us how they do the checks. You wave the device over the thing in the arm?
Right. So we've got there's a reader that's available, and the reader is it's an RFID NFC technology. So that's near field communications, and it's like your contactless payment cards. And you hold that over the sensor, and in 1 second it transmits 8 hours worth of glucose information. 8 hours of information is stored within the sensor, and this is unique, right? Because continuous glucose monitors don't store information on the sensor. Once they broadcast something, they forget about it. And the Freestyle Libre system stores 8 hours worth of information every 15 minutes in the sensor. And then the reader's got 90 days worth of that information at a time. And what we've done is we've used open standards, and we've used we've partnered with IDC in Minneapolis to use the ambulatory glucose profile, so that it takes all of this complicated spaghetti on a plate looking information and it boils it down so that you can share it easily with your doctor. You can understand it yourself, and it makes glucose information much more actionable than it's ever been before.
One thing that I was surprised about, and you tell me why this is, when the approval came through in the U.S., it came with a 12-hour warm-up period, whereas in other countries, as I read, the warm-up period is much less. In other words, you stick it in your arm, but you have to wait 12 hours to get readings. Why is that, and why the difference in the U.S.?
So Freestyle Libre is available in 40 different countries right now. It's reimbursed in 17 European countries mostly. And so we've rolled this out worldwide, and what we've learned is that every country's got different ways of approving and regulating medical devices, and we've worked closely with the FDA as our partner to get the claims for Freestyle Libre exactly right to eliminate finger sticks for people in the United States, and that's where we've arrived with this 12-hour warm-up period and 10 days.
So that was more of an FDA thing. It's not as though there's a different product that's coming to the U.S.
That's right.
Do you think, all right, now this is a question I don't know if you can answer. Do you think that that'll change? Because to know that in Australia they're using it, they're warming it up for a lot less time in the U.S. And I guess the other question I should ask is that hardwired in? I mean, can I as a patient say 1 hour, I'm done, or do I have to really put it in and wait?
So it's a different product in the U.S., and it's set to shut off after 10 days. And we've got a really amazing pipeline coming. We've got we're working on extending the sensor. You can see in Europe we've got smartphone applications that are available and caregiver applications. So you don't necessarily have to carry the reader around in the future once we're able to roll these innovations out. So I think the best thing to do is to stay tuned and watch how we develop and we extend this product. We've got really exciting things coming.
So you do plan on, that was my next question, on some kind of remote monitoring for caregivers?
We do. So the way that works in Europe and countries where this is approved is that you send your child off to school, and then maybe they've got a Samsung or an Android smartphone, and they scan that smartphone, and that glucose information is then transmitted to you via the cloud so that you can see whether they're in the normal glucose range, they're hypoglycemic, or they're hypoglycemic. So that's one of those innovations to watch for that's coming.
Can you talk to me about MARD? And, we'll explain what that is, but basically how accurate the Libre is?
Sure, yeah. The Freestyle Libre system is exceptionally accurate, and that's why the FDA has approved it for use eliminating finger sticks in routine cases. And so MARD is the median absolute relative difference is what that acronym stands for, and it's what it is it's a measure of accuracy. And I think the best way to understand this is that accuracy isn't an end in itself, really. The end in itself is to help people with diabetes live better lives and to spend less time in hypoglycemia. And so despite Freestyle Libre being exceptionally accurate with the sub 10% MARD, we also know from our clinical studies and from our real-world studies that people spend less time in hypoglycemia with it. And that's really the important thing, is that's the end result that matters to people and helps them live healthier lives.
One of the things that we've heard a lot about with the Libre in the last couple of weeks is that you guys are partnering with Bigfoot to be part of their closed-loop system. I'm curious, can you tell me, knowing what we've talked about here, is the product, as you partner with Bigfoot, going to be slightly different? Because it would seem like it would have to be if they're looking to have a continuous system.
Yeah, the Bigfoot product is a slightly different product, right? Freestyle Libre, you have to scan a sensor. And so to close the loop, that implies that we've got a sensor that's broadcasting that glucose information. And so we'll talk more about that as we get closer to it. But Bigfoot's a really good partner for us because we both have the exact same mission, and that's to eliminate the pain and hassle of living with diabetes.
So I can't coax you into anything else with Bigfoot. I'll have to go to them.
Yeah. So on Bigfoot, it's still too early to talk more about that, and we'll announce more things as we get closer to it. We're slated for trials working with them in 2018.
So you've worked on this. You've been working on this kind of technology for more than 10 years. What's it like for you to know that you had to have been waiting, for this approval, and to know that people in the U.S. and really people around the world are using the product and are happy with it? That's got to be a great feeling.
Well, it's incredibly satisfying. It's one of the great pleasures of my life to be able to help people with diabetes. And, I'm a chemist. This is my training. And so this is the only thing I've worked on. I'd say that I've spent my career working on one molecule. And to be able to see this come to market in 40 countries that it's already on the market for, and then to see it come to America is really what I've worked for my whole career. I really couldn't be happier about it. And I think that's true for all of us at Abbott.
Wow. So this has been it for you for more than these 10 years here. Did you ever have a moment where you thought, what the heck? Let's get going on this. Why? Did you ever have a moment, or can you share a story that was discouraging about it?
Well, in research and product development, it's always got its ups and downs. And, and I think that this is what we do for our living. And so we weather those. But this is the moment, this is the end where it's all worth it. It's really all worth it to all those arguments we had about, what radius should this be? How small should it be? This is why we did that, and this is why we know that was the right thing to fight about.
Well, let me ask you this, and again, this may be an opinion you can't answer. As you mentioned, some of those other things that the FDA will take another look at, or as you give them other things like remote monitoring, do you think you'll reconsider that 12-hour warm-up, or is that something that you feel the FDA will insist on as you move forward?
On the 12-hour warm-up and on the duration, we're working on extending the sensor wear in both of those directions, and I think just stay tuned is the best thing to say.
Excellent. And I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to anyway, because that's how I am. With the Dexcom, it's not FDA approved. You know that many people will restart the sensor and get longer wear out of it. Is that possible with the Libre? Is that, I'm sure it's something that you're not supposed to do, but it doesn't seem like you could, right? It just shuts down.
Well, this is one of the strengths of the Libre system, right, is that the accuracy that's on the label, the sub 10% MARD, is designed in and it's locked into the product, and it's something that you can't defeat by putting in whatever glucose value you want to put in. You can't defeat it by restarting the sensor. All those things change accuracy, and that's something that you can't do with Freestyle Libre. It's a strength of the device. How's
your dad doing?
He's an 8-year survivor of pancreatic cancer. We're very, very happy about that.
That's amazing. Does it, and you mentioned this earlier, does it mimic, does he have type 1 diabetes by default?
In many cases with the Whipple, you do develop type 1 diabetes because they excise so much of your pancreas. He's been okay, and he's tried the Freestyle Libre system, and he's all right.
More information on the Freestyle Libre on Abbott, the basic system at diabetes-connections.com and in the show notes. As you heard me ask Chris, Bigfoot Biomedical is partnering with Abbott, is using the Freestyle Libre as part of their system. So let's move on and talk to Bigfoot Biomedical about what that means for them. Really quickly, if you're not familiar with Bigfoot, this is just a great story. A couple of years ago, it's got to be 3 or 4 years ago right now, there was a rumor about an automated artificial pancreas system that somebody in New York had developed their own. This was about the same time that we started hearing about OpenAPS and Dana Lewis and Scott Librand, but this was different. This was someone who wasn't out there, who didn't want his name known right away. And so somebody in the press named him Bigfoot, and because he was elusive, right? We'd heard about him. No one had seen him. Well, it turned out Bigfoot was Brian Maslish. He has a wife with type 1. He has a son with type 1, and they have both been using his algorithms and his device since 2013, and it's been working out really well. So Brian Maslish and a quartet of guys, these 4 guys, all of whom are very much touched by type 1, started Bigfoot Biomedical. And this is a company, you probably have heard of them as they have a pump coming out, and we talk about that. But it seems to be more than that, and we discussed that as well. They say on their website, comprehensive solutions for insulin requiring diabetes. It's a little bit more than just a pump. And today you're going to be hearing from Jeffrey Brewer. He is the president and CEO of Bigfoot Biomedical. He has a son who has type 1. He is also very well known for being the CEO of JDRF from 2011 to 2014. A lot to cover here. And by the way, we also talk about the investment that JDRF made to Animas, to Johnson & Johnson, several years back. When I asked that question, I did not realize that Jeffrey Brewer was the CEO of JDRF at that time. And if you're not familiar with that, JDRF gives money to companies, to do research. So we'll explain that and you'll hear about it in the interview. I'm going to come back after and give you my take on it because I just think it's a really interesting issue. And I know you want to get to what Bigfoot is doing. So here's my interview with Jeffrey Brewer. So Jeffrey, welcome back to the show. It's always fun to catch up. I appreciate it.
Great to be here.
All right, let's talk about all the stuff that's happening. First, can you explain, if people may not be familiar, just what Bigfoot Biomedical is all about? What are you all trying to do there?
Bigfoot is trying to help people who are dependent upon this drug called insulin, which, as you know, is a very difficult one to administer, requires a lot of work, a lot of math, a lot of planning, a lot of understanding of today complicated devices. You have to do a lot of work and in a way very meaningfully be your own doctor in order to self-titrate this very dangerous but also life-giving drug. We at Bigfoot believe that we have technologies available that if we were to blend them together and actually use the power of data and connectivity and artificial intelligence, that we could be very helpful in making it both easier to do on a daily basis, safer, so that you're taking the right amount at the right time. And we have defined this problem very broadly, not just the technologies that you carry around that sense glucose or pump insulin, but how that interacts with the rest of your life on the smartphone, how you actually deal with the company who gives you all the pieces. We think that's one company, and it'll be Bigfoot, that's going to simplify this and package it all together in a way that's going to make it more like other aspects of your life as a consumer. We're upping the game for medical device and for the tools that are necessary to live with insulin-requiring diabetes and just make it better, easier, and safer all around. That is our value proposition to people who live with type 1 diabetes and in the future, anybody who lives with diabetes that requires insulin. That is a big vision we have, and it's very much inspired by a personal interest in solving this problem. As you know, I have a son diagnosed at 7 with type 1 diabetes, now 22. A bunch of people at Bigfoot are affected by this disease, either in their own lives or the lives of their children or their spouses or other family members. We know what problem we're solving, and we put together a plan to deliver a solution that's going to be quite transformative in terms of helping people to have better lives. And at the end of the day, that's what our value proposition will be.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the insulin pump system that Bigfoot is working on. But I wanted to be clear that it really is more than that, isn't it? There's, as you mentioned, every aspect of diabetes you want to be involved in. Can you talk just a little bit more about that before we go on to the pump?
Sure. That is a very good point that you make. We're not a pump company. In fact, one of our solutions is going to leverage insulin pens and the ability to track the injections that you give and to take that data, combine it with CGM to make it actually live in a way that will help people and make recommendations to them over time about how they should change what basal insulin they're injecting, how much of that, what they should take at mealtime, how they actually do that decision-making around the insulin that they give, and doing so through shots. You can actually take the same artificial intelligence that we have harnessed in order to drive a pump, which is what some people will call an artificial pancreas. We call it automated insulin delivery, but the same thing. Taking that, you can also do a lot of good with shots. So we're not a pump company. We're not a pen company. We're not a CGM company. We're a solutions company, broadly defined, and taking the components and putting them together in a very digestible way, both for the person who uses the device or system, for the doctor who prescribes it, and again, that's another challenge that we need to talk about, and then ultimately the payer, the insurance that is going to reimburse it, because if it's not going to be reimbursed, it's not going to be useful to the person who needs it. We have to solve at Bigfoot all of those problems to make it a value proposition that's both compelling for the person with diabetes, the doctor or clinician who is supporting that person, and then also whoever's paying the bills.
No doubt. All right. I'm going to come back to those two issues because those are big issues of access, of prescription, of health insurance. But let's jump right into the automated insulin delivery system that you all are working on. The news came out recently that Bigfoot system will now use a Freestyle Libre glucose monitoring sensor. We just heard the interview from Abbott talking all about the Libre, what it is, how it works. This will be slightly different, I would assume. Bigfoot system would be automated, as you said. It's not as though you can be scanning all the time. Can you share a little bit, or as much as you can, about what you all plan and how you'll be using the Libre?
Sure. Happy to talk about that. Well, the Libre is a fundamental innovation in diabetes care. The simplicity of it, the ease of use over time, fewer pieces to assemble, an easier process for applying it, a longer life, sits on the body in a place which is better and more convenient and less likely to be knocked off. There's so much about it that just makes it easier and better. And then when you get to the idea that you don't have to calibrate it, which is basically to give it an external reference point for blood glucose by pricking your finger, that makes it easier still to remove that from the equation. These are all game-changing, and it required a tremendous amount of innovation to be able to have a sensor that comes out of the factory and actually be able to put that on, never tell it what it needs to know with a finger stick. That's actually much safer as well for an automated system. It makes it much simpler and digestible and easier to use for so many people. The first generation of the Libre is accessed through this scanning process that you mentioned, where you have a receiver that basically through an NFC connection, like Apple Pay, for instance, where you just bring them in proximity and the power actually comes from the handheld. It activates the sensor to transmit a series of values. It scans the last 8 hours of your glucose. That's a very cool product, and now over 400,000 people around the world are using it. It's the largest population of people using a technology that continuously captures glucose information. Our version of the sensor will have a wireless component that is going to broadcast those values to either our insulin pump, which is the hub of the architecture for the pumping system, or else one of the pen caps that will go on a insulin pen. It will be a slightly modified version, but using the same insertion process. It'll be the same form factor. It'll last the same amount of time. In fact, it's almost the exact same product with the exception of it's got a chip inside that is going to broadcast that signal.
So, in other words, that chip would then, to be completely obvious, it would take away the need for the person to scan, because they would see it, the system would read it, and it would show up somewhere else, or could you still do it? I mean, what would be the idea? You'd see it on a phone?
That's correct. It will actually send wirelessly the values for glucose in real time to some other component, a Bigfoot pump, or a device that will go on as a cap for an insulin pen. And those two will communicate with each other.
So until this change, you all were partnering with Dexcom, and I don't want to get too much into what's better, which one. I mean, but can you share a little bit about why you decided to make that change?
Well, we believe it's better for our vision. Our vision is simple. That we need tools which are easier to use for the average person that is not seeing an endocrinologist. Most people with type 1 diabetes in this country, and that's 66%, actually see a primary care provider, not an endocrinologist for the treatment of their diabetes. For type 1 and for type 2, it's actually a higher percentage see the primary care provider. So if you look at who is the doctor or the clinician interfacing with these patients, today, the only way you're prescribing CGM or an insulin pump is through an endocrinologist. And quite frankly, most endocrinologists are reluctant to prescribe those technologies unless the patient is very savvy and already pretty sophisticated about their diabetes, because interpreting complex charts and graphs that are trying to actually serve as the basis for changes to the way a person titrates insulin, that's requiring a specialized skill that is in very short supply. My son was lucky to be able to see very well-established endocrinologists who are some of the best people in the world on the cutting edge of research for these devices and systems. But I'll tell you that even at places in New York City, which were the premier care centers, I had to make an appointment a year in advance. And literally, if you lost when you were at the clinic every 3 months and you forgot to make the appointment, you'd lose that whole 3-month window. It's just crazy. There's not enough endocrinology in order to meet the need of an expanding population of people, especially when you include type 2. So we've got a fundamental problem to solve, which is you got a bunch of people who are going to range the gamut of education and income, engagement with disease, access to endocrinology resources, good, bad, insurance. We want to serve all these people, and the only way you can do that is simple, which is going to require less training. And at the end of the day, taking big steps out in the insertion process, in the usage process day to day, things like finger stick calibration never having to be done. The benefit of that is we can actually deliver an easier experience that can be available to more people. And it also happens to be safer, because one of the things that is problematic about calibrating a sensor is that if the sensor needs to be calibrated with a finger stick, it literally doesn't know anything about glucose levels. All it's giving you is a measurement of some electrical charge off the end of the sensor when glucose is present in the body. But to know whether your glucose is 100 or 200 or 300, it literally needs to get this outside reference point that you give it when you prick your finger. And if you make a mistake in that process, which people do all the time, not washing your hands, actually not using an alcohol swab, not using the second drop of blood instead of the first drop of blood, because that has a clinically meaningful difference in terms of the value that you might get, and then never calibrating in a period where your glucose is changing, like after you ate or after you exercised, you have to do all those things to get the right reading that would actually calibrate the sensor properly. And people, they don't wash their hands, and they don't actually take that care. And most of the time, if you sit down at the table and you do a test and it says you're 350 when you know you're not because you gave yourself insulin, you go wash your hands and then you come back and do the test and you're 80, it's okay. But when you're doing automation of insulin delivery in the background and you're just using that calibration and it's no longer being filtered through the person's brain, and you have to count on the system to do the right thing and never give anybody more insulin than they need, then that calibration error, even if it gets through once, is very dangerous. Doing away with that entirely is a huge safety advantage when it comes to automation of insulin delivery. Because if you're going to take some of that away from the person and put it on the computer, that computer has to always get it right, and always getting it right presupposes you have the right data and the right value for that data, which with calibration is a dicey prospect. So Abbott's the only one that can do that for the foreseeable future. That and a number of other usability features just made it a very clear choice for us.
It's really interesting to hear all of that because, and if you'll just let me play devil's advocate for a moment, all of the other hybrid closed loop systems, let's call them, or working toward auto insulin systems, including Bigfoot's with Dexcom before this one, seem really promising. You've got Bigfoot, you've got the iLet, you've got Tandems and Type 0, and even the Medtronic closed loop that's out, or hybrid closed loop that's out right now. None of them are using the Abbott. All of them rely on calibration and finger sticks. And they all seem to be working, I mean, from a layperson position where I am, let's say, okay, and very promising. Are you saying that taking the finger sticks out with the with the Libre will really make that much of a difference?
There are two different questions there. One is, are any of those things better than what we're doing today? And the answer is yes.
Right.
The 670G, even though it asks you to calibrate 4 times a day, in the middle of the night, it might save your life because it'll turn off insulin delivery when you don't need insulin because you're at risk of going dangerously low. That's a good thing. If you can hack your own system, the folks who were shown the way by our co-founder, Brian Maslish, Bigfoot, who basically was the first one to hack into a pump and a CGM and tie them together through a smartphone and then begin to automate insulin delivery. That's a better thing than you can buy from any company today, actually. These are good things, but they have dangers in the calibration process, which could expose you to risk. But in a situation like Bigfoot would have just required us to ask more of the person and required us to be a little less aggressive in terms of how we could help them to mitigate the risk that we were getting bad information through that calibration process. So if you're comparing to what exists, which is people giving themselves semi-random doses of insulin and, seeing how that works out 8 hours later, no question. Any sensor that requires calibration that's thoughtfully married to an insulin
No,
pump
but I'm
is a
not.
better
I'm
situation.
not asking about that. I'm asking about, the stuff like Type 0 and all the clinical trial stuff that seems so promising, but that is not out yet. Is everybody in those clinical trials, and you guys did one with Dexcom, right? Is everybody in that using like incredible calibration and using the second drop of blood, right? I mean, that's all I'm asking.
In the clinical trials, in the clinical trials, you have a level of support and oversight and encouragement to adhere to the process that they've outlined that doesn't exist in the real world once somebody's been using something for a year or two and they stop taking all those steps and stop following all the steps. They experiment and they see, well, maybe I don't need to use the alcohol swab because mostly it works out okay. Second drop of blood, how often does that actually make a difference? And then at some point they're not washing their hands and they're just trying to filter out whether or not, it looks like a number that accords with how they feel.
Yeah.
You know how it is. This is a debilitating disease that takes too much out of your life. And first things people do are look for shortcuts. And
I have a 12-year-old son.
To the system.
Yeah, he's not washing his hands every time. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I was just trying to get to the bottom of, what we've seen in the past in terms of clinical trials, and if they're doing those, let's call it good calibration technique. I think that's really important because it kind of changes our perspective on what we can expect when it all comes out on the market.
Well, this is not a theoretical issue for us, because we have probably a dozen people here who have type 1 diabetes, and about 8 of them are wearing hacked systems that they put together themselves using a Dexcom sensor. So they actually understand this problem in reality. For instance, on any sensor, you can get a pressure artifact, which means you are leaning on the sensor or sleeping on it, and the site becomes stale. The fluids that are basically feeding the area around the sensor don't replenish.
Like a compression low.
The glucose gets... Exactly. There you go. So you get an alarm in the middle of the night that says you're low, and then you basically wake up, you do a test, and you're not low. It may say that you're 150 when the sensor was telling you you're 60. Then you calibrate at that time with that number and turn over, and then basically you've added to what the sensor thinks it should be, and it's starting to give you insulin based on that. That's a risk that, we see all the time. People in real life of using these hacked systems are actually experiencing these discontinuities between what glucose actually is and what the sensor's saying based on calibrations that turn out not to be very useful. If you don't have to deal with any of that or ever think about it, the first thing that is the best way to improve a product is not to have to train somebody to do something that they don't need to do. That's simplicity in itself. And just explaining proper calibration procedure takes a lot of time for somebody who's new to the disease or new to devices. We're looking for ways to take back all the stuff that today people have to do in order to live safely. It's important to live safely. It's also important to live well. And part of what diminishes quality of life with this disease is that there's just too much to worry about, too many steps to follow, too much to plan, too many calculations to make. Wherever we can claw that back, and this is a good example, we think it's a good thing that people will appreciate and will actually help them to live better because they can focus on the important stuff.
Way back at the beginning of all this, we mentioned doctors and insurance companies. And you touched on doctors a bit in terms of less training, general practitioners prescribing this, not having to see a high-level endo. What about insurance companies? I mean, this is all great. It's lots of products get out there, and then nobody can pay for them. How are you going to work around that?
Yeah, so I think people ask, why isn't CGM more popular today, or why aren't more people wearing insulin pumps? Well, I think there are 3 reasons. One of them we've been talking about, which is these devices, whether you're talking about CGM or pumps, they're complicated and they require a lot of training and a lot of engagement by the user. So that's one problem. But the other problem is that doctors, in order to prescribe them, they inherit a big training obligation, training somebody to use a CGM safely, in order to training them to interpret data, the graphs and charts that you can generate with data, actually interpreting that data in order to drive insulin titration decisions. That's complicated stuff, requires a loop of feedback from patient to clinician to patient to clinician, if you're lucky, right? If you're lucky and can see an endo every 3 months. That's just not a scalable model because there aren't enough doctors. But another big barrier is that payers don't actually think that it works very well in practice to reduce any costs or to improve outcomes, because they actually see that in practice, the patients who are already doing the best and are the most sophisticated and the most engaged are the ones who are using these devices. And so that's great that it's a tool for them, and it may actually improve their ability to stay safe. But the problem is it doesn't scale. So just because some people do better with CGM doesn't mean that if you give CGM to the average person as it exists today, that they're going to be able to interpret all that data and make the changes that the early adopters are able to make. And I think the insurance companies are very biased in thinking that all the trials that show give a person a CGM and they have a reduction in A1C, give a person a pump and they have a reduction in A1C, less hypoglycemia, all that's done at the academic care centers where those good doctors are, not in the real world where the doctor might not be that engaged or might even be a primary care provider who doesn't actually have any specialty understanding of diabetes and insulin titration. So when you try and give it to that part of the system, in some cases, it's not benefiting them at all. In some cases, they're actually doing worse. I had a birdie tell me one time that in CareLink, all the data that gets uploaded to Medtronic's database in the sky, that about a quarter of the pumps are actually like VCRs that are flashing 12. I hope that's a metaphor that people get generally. I'm getting old. Meaning that they're not configured at all. Like literally, they're like out of the box. The payers know that a lot of these pumps and a lot of these sensors are not being used to any healthcare advantage and are simply adding cost. And so they give you hoops to jump through. So, for instance, you have to have a form that says, I testify as a doctor that this person has tested 4 times a day, 4 finger sticks a day, religiously for 3 months, and proves that they're very compliant and they listen to instructions and do everything they're told by their doctor, and therefore they're ready for a pump or a CGM. Well, that's crazy, because that basically, if you're testing 4 times a day and doing a good job already, that is where we're focusing the technology. But the people who aren't testing very frequently and are walking around with HbA1cs of 10, like unfortunately my son right now, that is a problem which is fixable in oh so simple a way, but you have to have robust technology that is going to be trainable by in the presence of a primary care provider and actually be something that people can largely onboard on their own through a self-training digital process that is supported by the company, not by the healthcare system, and that also doesn't ask more of them than they're willing to give. That is the real challenge to solve in terms of our healthcare system. The complicated devices that maybe are more powerful theoretically, if delivered under the care of the best endocrinologists in the world, there's a solution for that. There isn't a solution for the other thing of people more broadly. And Bigfoot is going to err on the side of simplicity, ease of use. There needs to be a collection of options on the marketplace. And I hope that in 3 or 4 years of some of the mentioned options you're talking about in terms of closed-loop systems, I hope they're all on the market, because I think the market needs competition. It needs diversity. It needs a richness that comes from competition. And I'm really sad that we're going in the other direction.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you about that in just a minute, but I have to ask you something that perked my ears up. And I hope you take this question in the supportive way it is meant. You were the CEO of JDRF. You have been called the father of the artificial pancreas. You are a leader at Bigfoot Biomedical, and your son does not have a perfect A1C. Can you share a little bit about just how tough this is? Because I hear from people all the time, and they say, wow, you must really know what you're doing. You know, your son must be perfect. And he is 12. He is far from perfect. Yes. And I don't think perfect is a goal here. Oh, well, thank you. Yeah,
Actually,
you are.
You're the one that's perfect. Yeah.
You are too.
You're doing all the work, right?
No, not. You know, at 12, he's got to do. You know what? He was diagnosed at 2, so I was perfect once. But it's a lot different now that he's on his own. I mean, he really is a very independent kid, and when you're doing it all for them, it's harder, but it's easier. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're making a very important point, and I've experienced both ends of the spectrum. So my son was doing pretty well when his parents were doing it, and obviously, as you are and as many parents are, when your kid needs help, is sick, you're all over that, and it's your job, it's your responsibility, and you want to help them. And to the extent that you're able to control the situation, that's why I actually hear a lot of parents who are thrilled with the 670G, even though it requires a lot of work. You got to calibrate it in the middle of the night. Great, they'll do it because, we'll do anything for our kids. However, when you start to reach these transition points, and you're starting to see the beginning of that, it becomes more complicated. And then other things like, there's just a typical teenage rebellion and my parents are stupid and get out of my room and why are you so annoying? That all becomes blended with the diabetes. And then you try and do a deal like I did and say, if we could just argue and disagree about all this other stuff, but not on the diabetes, just give that one to me. I literally did say stupid stuff like that where I was trying to make a deal that obviously can't be made. Let's just do the craziness in the other parts of your life, but let's keep you safe. But it's just, not that easy, not that simple. People have priorities in their lives, whether they're adolescents or adults. It actually becomes all over the life cycle a problem because, you think they get out of adolescence and then they, the frontal lobes start to develop and they start to think about the future. But then they go and they get a job and they're worried about their job. They're worried about hanging out with their friends. They're worried about their girlfriend. Those things are more important than diabetes. And then you get married and then you have kids and the kids are more important than your diabetes. Providing for your family is more important for the diabetes. What your boss wants is more important than the diabetes. It turns out there's always all this stuff competing with diabetes. And when you're a parent, diabetes is first. And so we're going to be all over it. But when they start to grow up, and especially during those awkward teenage transition years, it just gets messy. And this is living with chronic disease that I don't think I understood as well as I should have or wish I had. Doing something every day and all throughout the day for the rest of your life and never having a chance to take a day off or do something different or just lie in bed and not think about it. There's nothing I can think of that I have actually done every day of my life, except maybe drink a cup of coffee, mostly since I was an adult. And that is actually something I like. Like in the morning, it makes me feel better, more optimistic, gives me more energy. It's good feedback, and so I do it every day. Diabetes, not so good feedback, right? It's mostly bad feedback. You're out of range. You're doing something bad. It's either going to be a short-term risk in hypoglycemia, a long-term risk in terms of complications. You're always getting all this negative feedback, and people they can't just absorb it all. That's why the data is not what people need. They don't need more messages about how they're failing. They need help to do better and to feel good about that. And so my experience has been all the way from the parent who was hyper-engaged, because that's what parents do, to the kid who's completely in control and now not really prioritizing his diabetes, and I have no control whatsoever. And the thing that will work is the thing that works for him and allows him to trade off against whatever else he's prioritizing in his life. And that's what we're developing at Bigfoot, and it's a great experience because we have all these people who have different perspectives on the disease, a bunch of people who have the disease as adults, all of whom struggled during the adolescent phase if they were diagnosed as children, by the way. That's the one thing that can make you feel better. I hope that, whatever struggles you have ahead of you, they're all the same. The kids don't get it. It's hard. Parents take it too seriously. It's a no-win situation. It's an unreasonable expectation to burden a young person or even an adult with all these responsibilities. So we're just trying to help with technology like it helps in the rest of our lives. The things that I have on my smartphone that simplify my life and make it more convenient, allow me to get a car, a meal, clothes, whenever I want them, right to my door. If we could bring some of that convenience factor to diabetes, I just think it would be so incredibly life-transforming. And right now, we're the only people really focused on that as a a solution. So we feel we have a pretty big opportunity and also a pretty important mission.
Which leads me to the question I'm sure you love the most. Can you talk about timeline at all? I know you have some clinical trials coming up. Can you kind of spell out what you can for us in terms of timeline?
Yeah, it's actually pretty straightforward because when you're a company and you're raising money and you're making promises to investors, you have to be able to tell the story of how long it's going to take and how much you're going to spend in order to do it, how many people you're going to need. And so we have very detailed plans that I was just reviewing up until the moment I got on the phone with you, for instance, that are going to have us developing two different systems, remember, one with the connected injections, one for the automated infusion. Those two systems are going to be going through a clinical trial process, the pivotal trial commencing at in the latter half of next year. That will lead to a submission to the FDA the next year. We will be on the market in 2020, which I can tell you seems, especially personally for me, like a very long way away, because my son isn't using any of the existing high-tech solutions. He doesn't wear a CGM because it gives him so many false alarms and it's so invasive in his life. He wouldn't use a 670G because there's no way he's going to calibrate 4 times a day, and it's going to be requiring more than he was going to give to the diabetes right now. And the hatch systems, an open APS or the like, those are just too brittle. They require too much debugging and rebooting and pairing and all that kind of stuff. He's just not going to go to that much trouble. So until Bigfoot is on the market, my son's not going to be safe, and that's sad for me. But I know we're doing the right long-term focus. It's going to help the most people, and so 2020 is better than never. But I, as a parent, and we have a bunch of people around here who have a similar touch point and self-interest, time is important to us. And we did absorb some delay to switch to the Freestyle Libre sensor. It's going to take us a year longer to get to the marketplace. I can tell you that was not an easy decision because I think about a year longer my son will live without help. But it was the right decision because it's going to help us deliver the best product. It's going to help the most people and be the most vibrant business. And at the end of the day, that's the mission that we have undertaken.
Jeffrey, before I let you go, you mentioned a step backwards in diabetes technology, and I assume you meant the demise of Animas, getting out of the insulin pump business. I do want to ask you, if I could, you were the CEO of JDRF from 2011 to 2014. And there's been some chatter that over those years, and maybe it was before that, JDRF gave money to Animas to help, develop the artificial pancreas projects, as JDRF has done with many companies. Any idea what happens to that research or that technology, or is that just a chance that charities take when they make donations like that?
So I can answer that, unfortunately, very directly, because I was the chief advocate for that deal that provided resources to Johnson & Johnson. That was very much in the center of our initiative to try and help industry to move faster. I actually sat with the CEO of J&J and senior leadership, and they explained that there was an opportunity to do insulin automation, bringing an Animas pump and a Dexcom sensor, that they didn't have the resources to prioritize it. And at that point, there was literally no company that would and was interested in doing so. And there is precedent for charities helping to stimulate R&D efforts inside companies for areas that, frankly, don't justify that in terms of the investment. J&J is looking at a whole broad portfolio of businesses that are more profitable than the insulin pump business. They are going to invest because their shareholders dictate in what are the best opportunities. This one was falling down the line because there wasn't a clear path through FDA. Insurance companies were fighting the reimbursement of, at that point, even CGM, which wasn't covered yet. There was just a lot of skepticism. It was a good business to get into. JDRF was starting to get the ball rolling. We'd done all this testing in clinical trials, proof of concept, using all the pumps, all the sensors, tying them together with algorithms, and it all was a great thing. It was safe. It was better than what people do for themselves. And then we were working with the FDA to try and plow a path through, and we thought if we can just get some companies that are going to be lined up to do it, and J&J seemed like, as one of the largest, most successful medical device companies in the world, seemed like a good prospect. I thought we had a plan. We provided resources. They provided some resources, and the project failed because I don't believe they knew what they were doing at the end of the day. And that is why I'm doing what I'm doing today, because if we're waiting for the big companies to save us and deliver the products we need, it's not going to happen. That was a painful learning experience that these companies literally don't understand the patient. They don't understand the problem. They don't understand smartphones. They don't understand cybersecurity. They don't understand artificial intelligence. They don't understand design for consumers and how simple and easy that needs to be. They are medical device companies that sell complicated machines to hospitals and to doctors' offices. They don't understand how to actually blend these technologies together and solve this problem. And that painful learning experience, which I completely and totally own and take responsibility for, was part of my journey. And so if anybody wants to blame JDRF, they can put my name at the top of the list. I thought I was doing the right thing, and I thought that working with the established players and trying to get partnership and JDRF have skin in the game to help them, it seemed like the right approach. But the reason I'm here now, I guess 8 years later from initiating that partnership, I'm doing my penance.
Wait a second. I'm not trying to give you cover here, because you can take all the blame you want, I guess. But isn't there something to be said that they have 8 years of data? People wear it. Insurance companies cover it. There are more companies making it. Can't something good have come out of it? I mean, Animas pump was the first pump we ever used. I love it, and I'm sad like everybody else. I was waiting for that hyper minimizer they were talking about and everything else that was coming out. But isn't there something that happened that we can take some solace in?
Not at J&J.
Wow. Okay.
Because they have better ways to invest their money that are going to drive a greater return. They're not committed to diabetes, and they're certainly not committed to people with type 1 diabetes, and they made that clear. That's why you need a company that's literally focused on living or dying and succeeding in that area. Brian and his DIY project literally run circles around anything they ever did at J&J, and that's the God's honest truth. They didn't know what they were doing, and they wasted a bunch of money, and then ultimately had to put a bullet through their own business. It is the greatest example for why you need to have focus, and that this is going to be solved by startups. Startups change the world, and that's every other aspect of the economy. When something really game-changing comes, it rarely comes from a big company. That's why I'm still as impressed as I have been with any company in history at this scale that Abbott came up with the Libre, because it is a fundamental leap forward. Every once in a while it happens, and that's why we're going to be great partners. But at the end of the day, I think you need to count on the innovation coming from small companies that are just laser focused on the future. Big companies always have a lot of options. They always have a hedge of the current to the future, and then they end up buying the things that work. This is a very different space, and things are going to work a lot different in the future. You also need to look at which companies are focused on diabetes and are going to live and die by being successful in diabetes. That is a key driver here. I don't think J&J ever was.
Well, I appreciate you being so frank about it. One other thing I meant to ask you, I'm sorry I didn't get to, and I know we're talking a long time here, the smartphone aspect. I've been told off the record by a few people that the FDA will never approve anything controlled by a smartphone, at least not in the near future, because they always want to have that backup, that receiver, the controller. Isn't Bigfoot, the automated insulin, going to be controlled by a smartphone, or is it a smartphone-like device? Help me out here understanding that.
Oh no, you're going to have an app on a smartphone that is going to be an interface to an automated insulin delivery system that is going to allow you to make mealtime announcements. It depends what you mean by control. What people mean when they say it can't happen is you can't actually put all the brains of the operation onto a smartphone, because the smartphone will run out of battery power, it will be out of range, you'll drop it and break it. There's all sorts of situations where the smartphone is going to not be available to do its job. So what you need to do is you have to have a very nuanced blending of responsibility sharing between the devices that are on your body and the app that's on the phone, and you need to have all the important stuff happening on the validated lockdown medical devices. That's where you need to be able to continue automating insulin delivery. Think about the phone like a keyboard or a monitor is to a CPU. The CPU is where all the action is. The keyboard and the monitor are just showing, impulses of light and then sending electrical impulses of yes or no back down the other, or 0 and 1 back down the other way. That's the same way with our system. The phone, and this is the reason we'll be able to do an off-the-shelf phone, not one that the company actually has to send to you, or really isn't a phone that is really just a receiver. That is something you got to build from the ground up. You can't bolt it on after the fact. Every aspect of the system, from the security to the connectivity, to the human interface to the machine on the pump itself, or the pen, or the sensor, all that needs to be designed as a system from the ground up to do what it can do or should do, and to be secure and to be safe. And that's what we spent the last 3 years doing at Bigfoot. It is something that takes a lot of technical expertise here in Silicon Valley, but also a deep understanding of medical devices and what they can do, and how to actually develop a whole solution. And we're the only company that's really thinking about the world like that. Everybody else is trying to make pieces and then sort of bridge them together. But the pieces need to be changed by the software and vice versa. It needs to all work together, like a Mac does with an iPhone, with iCloud, and with iTunes, and with my desktop. There's a whole system architecture behind that was designed for everything to work together and to serve some purpose. Medical device has never been designed like that. And so we're excited.
Well, it's exciting to hear about, and I can't thank you enough for going through and explaining it so well and really taking your time with me, especially as I understand the system. But Jeffrey, thank you so much. It's great to talk to you again, and I hope you'll continue to keep us posted.
I will, and I appreciate your giving me the opportunity to talk about what we're doing. Obviously, it's important to us, but we know it's important to a lot of people out there as well. And we're working as hard as we can to move it as quickly as we can to get it to the most people, and appreciate the support on Facebook and on Twitter. And for a company that's a few years away from having a product on the market, we've got this rich audience of people who are paying attention and rooting us on, and I can tell you that it makes a meaningful difference. We're motivated by it every day. So thank you.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Lot to take in there. I have all the information at diabetes-connections.com and in the show notes. You get the show notes wherever you listen. If you're listening on a podcast app, they should be right there. Sometimes you have to click, find out more or full description, but it should be there. If not, just go to diabetes-connections.com. It's kind of tough to get the show notes on Facebook, but I do link everything up within those show notes, so you should be able to find what you need. And Bigfoot has a lot going on, and we will continue to check back in with them. So I said I would talk a little bit about Johnson & Johnson. And, as I make clear, we are sponsored. We have been sponsored by Animas since close to the beginning. We are now sponsored by One Touch, which is still part of Johnson & Johnson. I use their products. I loved Animas. And I'll be honest with you, just as I've pointed out where I think other people are doing salesman type stuff, I do think that, that harshness of saying that nothing came about of that deal can we really say that? That investment into Animas at a time where nobody was looking into that kind of integration, whereas he said it had stalled. That investment pushed, in my opinion, CGM and integration forward for everybody. I mean, if there's no competition, if Animas isn't looking into that, why would Medtronic? Why would Tandem? Why would Type 0 move ahead? Why would Omnipod move ahead? If everybody's staying static, then why would anyone move forward? So if JDRF doesn't make that multi-million-dollar investment to find the better algorithm and to move ahead, yes, it's disappeared. Maybe nothing will ever happen from that in Johnson & Johnson. But as just an observer, it just doesn't make sense that it would disappear and it wouldn't make any difference, because I really do believe it already has. Now, I could be way off base. Feel free to tell me that I am. Stacey at diabetes-connections.com. But that just makes sense to me. As somebody who's not running a company, making an insulin system, that's going to be competing with other companies making insulin systems. Okay, so a lot to digest there. Boy, that's a bad segue. And speaking of digestion, no, I can't do that. Okay, I already said it. But let's talk about no foods. I first noticed no foods, and again, it's KNOW, when we were covering Bike Beyond, from Beyond Type 1, the cross-country bike ride from New York to California all summer long. No Foods was a sponsor. They gave lots of food to the bikers, and I kept seeing in Instagram and online lots of pictures of the food. But then, and we'll talk about this in the interview, but amazingly to me, the founder at one of the events in California stepped up and said he was going to buy the bikes for every rider on the trip. I didn't realize that they didn't already own the bikes. These were bikes that they had kind of borrowed, very expensive specialty bikes. And Steve Hanley stood up at this event and said, "You got to have the bikes. I'm buying you the bikes. We're in." And I thought, who the heck is that guy? Why would he do this? I got to talk to him. So we'll have a conversation. And of course, I had to ask about all the food. Now, I say in the interview that I have never tried no foods. Since then, well, I think immediately after we hung up, Steve sent me the package, but we got this big package of foods to try. I'll tell you about that after the interview. But here is my talk with Steve Hanley. Steve, welcome to Diabetes Connections. I'm so glad you had some time to spend with me and my listeners. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Stacey. Good morning, and I greatly applaud your leadership in this space. It's amazing, the noble, courageous journey you've undertaken, and we really appreciate what you've done.
Well, thank you so much. So listen, we're going to talk about the food and the company and the mission, but you came to my attention when the Bike Beyond folks were in Napa, and we followed them all summer long. A lot of great information about, of course, this cross-country bike ride put on by the folks at Beyond Type 1. And you announced that you had sponsored them. You'd been, along, even before it started, that you were purchasing the bikes for all of the riders. I don't think people realize that those were borrowed bikes. And then these were not inexpensive bikes. Why were you moved to do that? That's amazing.
Well, what's amazing, frankly, is not my gesture, but what's amazing is the, once again, courageous journey that these 20 bicyclists undertook. They dedicated 80 days out of their summer to pedal from New York to San Francisco and to do nothing but raise awareness for the type 1 diabetes circumstance and to help bring awareness. And we were at the Napa Valley sort of conclusion, and I was told opportunistically, and in fact, just almost anecdotally, frankly, that the bikes had to be returned, and how the team had been told days earlier, and they were frankly despondent, as if they had gotten their hearts ripped out of their chest relative to, the sort of the relationship to some degree they had formed with these, with the bikes that had taken them across country. And it was an injustice, Stacey. It was something that was just morally dysfunctional, to be candid. And Sarah Lucas is such an amazing leader, as you are probably aware. She's one of the 4 founders of Beyond Type 1. And when she told me that, instinct took over. It wasn't like I didn't weigh the business case. I didn't think through, what's the ROI on this decision? I was just like, we will buy the bikes. And I said, listen, go ahead and announce it before I change my mind, right? Like before sensibility kicks in, right. Whatever. And, before I think about how I explain this to my board of directors. In any case, so Sarah and Tom, her COO, announced it, and it was an outpouring of emotion unlike anything I've ever experienced. And it was a dog pile to some degree, right? They sort of jumped on me and all that, but and so it was just really nice to know that they could keep this now lifelong connection to the bikes that had carried them across country.
Yeah, I would imagine that, as you said, carried them across country, and they did the back tire dip on the East Coast and the front tire dip on the West Coast. There's a lot of emotion there. How did your board respond when you finally told them?
Well, the quarter's not over yet, so I sort of haven't told them yet. So given that we're performing super well on the financial side, I'm going to use that as my cosmetic Excellent. And air cover to what took place. But no, of course, they're an amazing team. The board and our entire investor set, they understand that this is a mission to help make a grain-free dent in the universe, to help reset expectations relative to health, wellness, diet, and nutrition, because as you're very aware, right, it's the statistics attached to 70% of the nation's obese and overweight. Life expectancy ticked down for the first time in 40 years in December of 2016, despite all the advances in technology. MD Anderson declared that 50% of all lung cancer in non-smokers is caused by eating high glycemic index foods like white bread and bagels. So we're just looking to make a change and to have people, per the brand, know better about the intelligent food choices they should be making relative to their health and wellness.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about what No Foods is. You are not a, quote, diabetes company, but you got involved with Beyond Type 1 because it really did seem to be a very good fit. These are not professional athletes, but these are people who are active and were going to be very active over the summer. And as I talked to many of them, I interviewed quite a few of the riders, they were concerned about their nutrition, and they were looking forward to trying a lot of the different things and talking to each other, how do the professional athletes eat and what do you recommend? How did this work out from your perspective? Did you give them the foods that they needed along the way? Did you educate them about what the product was? Take us through kind of the Beyond Type 1 experience first, and then let's talk about more of the company.
Great question, Stacey. So the genesis was in the relationship I have with Dr. Peter Attia, who, once again, is one of the foremost nutritional scientists in North America. He introduced me to Dr. Jay Kushner, who is at Baylor College of Medicine, Texas Children, and he's arguably or maybe inarguably the top endocrinologist in the nation. And Jake is very close with Jesse Levine, who's the sort of pseudo-captain of the Bike Beyond team. So through Peter and then Jake and then Jesse, they had me at hello. And I was just so taken in by what they were looking to do relative to their time, their dedication, and just the effort ascribed to traveling or pedaling 4,200 miles. And these are not folks who are professionals, as you noted, right? These are, and I'm not saying they're Jane and John Q. Citizen either. Obviously, they're fit individuals, but it still is a heroic, it's an Odyssean level journey.
Sure.
In any case, what we found is that in any business enterprise, the adoption curve is going to be dominated early on by those people who disproportionately benefit. And therefore, whether it be celiacs, whether it be those with autoimmune or Crohn's or now with diabetes, those who can have a reduction in their metabolic impact profile are going to receive benefit. And therefore, through the testing we had done, heretofore, we recognized that this was really hand in glove. And through the relationship with, once again, Peter, Jake, and Jesse, we then spoke with Sarah and her team, and we pulled it together, and we became one of the co-sponsors of this epic journey.
So how did it go on the road? Were they, this sounds kind of silly. I mean, obviously they're eating your food. I'm just curious, did they give you reactions? Did they give you feedback along the way? And I know you're not going to say that anybody didn't like it, but was there something that worked better than something else along the way?
To the person, they said it was the single best food they ever had. Just kidding. No, but seriously, what's so unique about this circumstance, Stacey, to be candid, is that there is, how there's no crying in baseball, right? The famous quote from the movie. Well, there's no lying relative to the reaction of a type 1 diabetic to the foods they eat, right? They're basically a human barometer relative to the impact of a particular food that they're consuming. And clearly, regardless of either, how much money we devoted to the cause or funding, if the food was not aligned with their ability to perform, to feel good, then they obviously wouldn't have consumed it. And in fact, the opposite happened. I just received message after message about how they were basically, quote unquote, living off our food, how we were, quote unquote, like a lifesaver, especially, late night eating one of our No Better cookies or in the morning a No Better waffle. And that was the best part about the journey, Stacey, is that it was so heartfelt, so genuine, so sincere to the person. Each one has written me letters, right? Handwritten. Each one has, sent me messaging, and they really are true life heroes, and they should be commended for what they did and their contribution to the cause.
So tell me about No Foods. We haven't talked specifically really about what it is, but this is, I don't want to call it prepackaged, but some of it is. Tell me a little bit about how you explain what no foods is. You mentioned waffles and things like that, but this isn't, in your freezer and then you put it in your toaster.
Indeed. So that's a great question. So it's really a counterintuitive, what I call inside-out business equation, where most companies would speak just to the food and, where they're available and what their velocity is or their run rate. We take an opposite approach. We take what we call a very different approach for very different results. For us, and this is really logical, Stacey, as we follow along, if the mission and purpose is health and wellness, right, with the challenges being, the usual suspects, obesity, diabetes, increasing healthcare costs, celiac disease, life expectancy, cancer, etc. And by the way, more people will be diagnosed this year with cancer from metabolic syndrome than from cigarette smoking. That's how bad the problem is. Mm-hmm. So if that's our mission and purpose, we said, okay, well, what attributes from a food perspective define health and wellness? So we just sort of made a list, right? We figured natural, non-GMO, and then we said grain, wheat, gluten, dairy, soy, peanut, yeast, starch, preservative, lactose, cholesterol free. And then we also said high protein, high fiber, low carbs, low net carbs, low sodium, low calories, low sugar with a zero metabolic impact. So if that's the formula, the next step in the logic train is what ingredients will fortify or enable those attributes.
And how do you make it not sound? And how do you make it not taste like tree bark?
And that's exactly
Sorry,
right.
I couldn't help myself.
Great, because regardless, it tastes great and delicious, right? It has to be at the has to be the tip of the spear. So we use superfoods, right? So we use almonds, coconuts, egg whites, chia, and flaxseed, and from there, we were then able to say, okay, now that we have our base formulation, let's create mainstream foods that are going to be aligned with the palate of quote unquote Jane and John Q. Citizen. Now, what I get so excited about, Stacey, is obviously on the science side, on the nutrition side, I'm seeing these continuous glucose monitor charts that are flatlined or going down, hearing the feedback from 6-year-old little girls who have type 1 diabetes with celiac, and they're reducing their insulin input by 45%, and their high lows are going down by 80%. What I love most is that it's not quote unquote crazy, right? You're not speaking to someone who's going to tell you about meat made in a lab or cricket insect powder protein bars or vegan cheese. I mean, I don't even know what that is. Vegan cheese, right? It's like, in any case, instead, I think this is pretty mainstream, right? Bread slices, waffles, wraps, muffins, pancake mix, cereal, pasta, syrup, donuts, cookies, buns, and cupcakes, right? It doesn't come with an instruction manual, right? I mean, if this double chocolate cupcake shows up, I think you and frankly, the kids of America will also know how to consume it. And that's the best part of it, because it's not like Soylent, right? Which, you pour, I guess, a mix into a glass of water and that's all you consume all day, right? We're talking, once again, muffins and pancakes and waffles. And what's been kind of funny, Stacey, I think you'll appreciate this as a parent, is I'm starting to get notes back from parents where they're speaking to, for lack of a better term, cognitive dissonance with their children. Because heretofore, the double chocolate cupcake was reserved for once a month or a birthday party. Now the parents are like pushing them on the kids like every day, and the kids are like enjoying it, right? Double chocolate cupcake. But then they're starting to think, is something bad about to happen? Like, are we moving to another town?
Right.
Are they trying to soften me up here?
That's funny, but it's true because we haven't had pancakes. We used to do like Saturday morning pancakes, and my son's had type 1 since before he was 2. So we never ate low carb, but I'll be honest with you, it was much easier when he was younger. And when you get closer to those tween and teen years, we have found that the foods that he could eat without much of an issue have become much more difficult. And I wonder, full disclosure, I haven't tried any no foods at this point. I wonder if something like that or a lower carb pancake, would be something that we could try at this point, because it's just not the same, when your kids are a little younger. Maybe it's a metabolism thing too.
Indeed. And remember, we don't dispel medical advice. We don't make any claims whatsoever, obviously on our packaging, on our website, et cetera. But we are, in full disclosure, formal national partners with not only Beyond Type 1, but with a range of other diabetes organizations like Christina Roth's wonderful College Diabetes Network, with the folks at Team Type 1, which is a Phil Sutherland group here in Atlanta, with You're Just My Type. And we've also had many interactions with the JDRF. We're a sponsor for the Children's Diabetes Fund, the Barbara Davis organization out of Denver. And therefore, that's not by coincidence. That wasn't because we just paid the proverbial king's ransom and they decided to put us on the website. Because, I mean, obviously, in that type of case, people could get hurt or worse, right, if there's some type of false portrayal of a food and how it could impact a type 1 diabetic. So, I mean, but the feedback, I mean, a gentleman like Richard Dykman, who is an extraordinary researcher out of Hawaii, once again, his group is called Type 1 Grit, and his son, just like you, Stacey, his son was diagnosed early on. In the last 15 years, he's done nothing but, as you know, not day to day, minute to minute, hour to hour, right, has been accountable for the maintenance of his health. And and they have the most sophisticated technology, and they've experienced our products, and they showcase, once again, it's a flat line relative to the migration of the bar, relative to the impact of the of glucose or the food on their internal system. So it's really been quite rewarding in that it's empirical. It's not just the just the anecdotal sort of nickel rocket that someone on social media can shoot out there. Oh, I feel great. Oh, it tastes great. Instead, and to be candid, we're actually going to release a glycemic index revamp that's going to be able to showcase where our food resides within those types of metrics. And unfortunately for some others, it's also going to show where others reside on that same scale, right? So those people who, once again, they put forth like stone ground organic flakes for cereal, and it sounds good, and it's a nice purple design, but of course they have organic cane sugar on there, and they portray it as healthy, and it's decidedly not. And we call that fake food. We think it's disingenuous. We think it's duplicitous. And it's time for the hygiene of illumination to come out on these other products. And people are going to see, what products truly are healthy and which ones are decidedly not.
What made you start No Foods? What's your background, and how did this come up for you?
Sure. I'm boring. I'm a tech geek. I'm a nerd. I just do nothing but consume voracious amounts of information. It's just that what happened was I had basically had a 35-year tech career, and in the last couple of ventures, it was high tech, like telematics, like information systems in cars, and then there was a group buying program with the American Cancer Society, the AAA motor clubs, and then when I sold my last company, I did a year of charity work, and you may have heard anecdotally or otherwise, there was a boxing match. It was an exhibition between, of all people, 5-time heavyweight champion Evander Holyfield and Mitt Romney in Salt Lake City. So of course it wasn't a real fight. It would have had a very unfortunate outcome if both pugilists were whatever released or unleashed. But in any case, we raised over $1 million in one night to help cure blindness for 50,000 kids. And then we did other work with the Starkey Hearing Foundation. We won an Emmy Award with the Prostate Cancer Foundation, and so that was really rewarding. And then at the tail end of my earnout, Peter Thiel, who's an extraordinary investor, an extraordinary leader, I had his signed book 0 to 1, which is all about reimagining, sort of tomorrow in all categories. And it really set me up on a trail of thinking through, what's next relative to what could be reimagined. And then a confluence of events happened, Stacey, where I had lost like 45 pounds in 60 days just by going grain-free, dairy-free, sugar-free about 5 years ago. So I knew that it worked. I also, oddly enough, I bought 3 smart waters at a movie theater one day for my daughter, my wife, and I, and it was $16. And I was thinking, wow, back when I was like in 1978, I was, screaming at my mom and dad saying, how can the French put water in a bottle, call it Perrier, and sell it? It's free, right? So I was wrong by 20 trillion on that one. But I realized that if water can be a and then you saw yesterday, Nestle just bought a stake in Blue Bottle Coffee for like $1 billion valuation. We know Starbucks is, 25 times $1 billion valuation. And I realized that ultimately, everyone loves bread, right? 155 million sandwiches a day, 60 pounds a year. And yet bread is decidedly bad for you by every possible, perspective. And if someone could bridge or reimagine bread in something that was both delicious and nutritious, there's probably a value proposition there that was unassailable. So knowing nothing about food, all I did was write down the attributes, as I explained earlier, right? The, grain, wheat, gluten-free, and the zero metabolic impact, et cetera. And I had a food scientist develop one set of formulation and a culinary expert go down a different path. He did vegetables like cauliflower bread, broccoli bread. The scientist did more nuts and seeds. And of course, I triangulated them with an incubator co-packer because, Stacey, as you might imagine, it's easy to create one of something, right? Like one cupcake or one waffle, but you have to make 10,000 an hour in order for it to be commercialized, mainstream, Amazon, Whole Foods, etc. So at the end of the day, the nuts and seeds beat the vegetables. We then did the business architecture relative to the business plan and what would be needed to fortify the venture to make sure that we could accommodate sourcing of ingredients and co-packing costs and distribution and marketing. And from there, we found some investors, and here we are a year and a half later, and we have 35 products. We're partners with these unbelievable organizations that we've noted earlier, even some on the non-sort of medical and wellness side, like Spartan, like American Ninja Warrior, Ultimate Team Challenge. In fact, we're the national sponsor for their World Championships in Lake Tahoe at the end of the month. We're sponsoring their CEO Challenge. And from there, we're now a 25-strong person organization. And the most important part of what we do is the feedback that we get that we're impacting lives from the range of celiac, T1D, but also into the CrossFit world, into Atkins diet, into ketogenic is getting so huge now versus paleo. So it's just nice to know. And to be exceedingly candid, I mean, I love my wife like no other husband loves their wife, and I love my daughter, and she's 10 years old, and she wears one of our No Foods T-shirts every night to bed. And to come home and know that I'm doing something that has merit, that has value, that is ethical, that is something that's helping others, it's the best feeling in the whole world.
That's fantastic. And to bring it full circle before I let you go, do I understand that you hired a couple of the folks from Bike Beyond, that they're working with you now?
Indeed, I actually have 3 type 1 diabetics on the team. We have Alexi Melvin in the West Coast. She's in the Berkeley area. And I call her the GOAT, which is an acronym for greatest of all time. She's one of the more remarkable human beings I've ever met. One who has, discovered her type 1, diagnosis about, 10, 15 years ago, and has just been absolutely amazing, has, contributed so much to our cause. And then I also hired Jesse Levine, the gentleman I spoke of earlier, who was sort of the captain of the team, and then a guy here in Atlanta named Ryan Dunn, who, from Georgia Tech, who's also just an extraordinary individual. And, so it's really nice to have 3, extraordinary people on the team, and they're contributing mightily. And it's I think it's a wonderful testimony that we're, sort of walking the walk and talking the talk.
That's true. And Jesse, man, he is deep into the nutrition. I interviewed him for the ride, and it turned into a whole conversation about food and energy, and it was remarkable. So I'm not surprised that he's interested in this. Steve, thank you so much for sharing your story. I'd love to check in with you now and then and see how it's going, but I really appreciate you spending some time with us.
Likewise. And as I kicked off the conversation, Stacey, it's individuals like yourself who are truly the most important people within this cause, because you are an evangelist, you create awareness. And to be candid, one of the challenges that I observe with the type 1 diabetics, and especially these heroic bicyclists, is that, quote unquote, they don't look sick, right? Like Jesse Levine is as fit and strapping an individual, and at the Napa event, he was on the dance floor and doing the splits and other gymnastic routines. Like, I'm not even sure I can do a log roll at this point, right? And I'm thinking, like, he's the one who's quote unquote classified as sick, right? Compared, so that's one of the challenges. And yet you do, from the intimacy of knowledge I have of the daily routines, what you've personally experienced, Stacey, you realize it's exactly the opposite, right? It's beyond serious, and it needs the funding, it needs the awareness that can help us, further understand this situation and what we can do about it.
Wow. Well, thanks again. I so appreciate it. Thanks, Steve. Wow. He is something else, really. It was a very nice conversation with Steve. And more information, of course, in the show notes or at diabetes-connections.com. And after that interview, Steve and his people sent me and my people a giant box of food. And I'm going to link up, he sent it to a couple of bloggers as well. Carrie Sparling from 6 Until Me wrote a great column because she had all her neighbors over and they all tried it. And, we didn't share it with our neighbors. So, I'll link up her review. Benny wants to do his own review as well. He's made some video of this, but I'll let the cat out of the bag and say we liked almost everything. We sampled everything except like the pancake mix. We didn't do stuff like that, but we sampled everything. And there were only 1 or 2 things. I think it was the bars that Benny didn't really like. I think that's just a little different taste for him, like a granola bar kind of consistency. And I thought it was okay. But the cupcakes, the waffles, the bread, the wraps, it was really nice. Really tasted good. We are fortunate not to have to do gluten-free, but the low glycemic index, the slow digestion, we bolused for chocolate chip waffles for Benny, and he went on the low side. Not a drop like sometimes happens with pasta, but kind of a slow and steady, didn't go up and then went down a little bit. It was chocolate chips. I've never seen him not have a spike. So it was really remarkable. We'll be talking more to Steve. He wants to get involved with the show. Maybe we'll do some giveaways. It's pretty cool stuff. So I'm looking forward to learning more about it, and I'll pass it on to you as well as we do. Want to let you know we have started a Facebook group for Diabetes Connections. I'm going to be sneaking this out here a little bit on social media, but as you listen, just search for Diabetes Connections, or you know what? I'll put it right in the show notes. That's the easiest way to do it. I will put in the show notes, Diabetes Connections, the group, because the Facebook page is fun, but I want to get to know you a little bit more. And I think it'd be great if you all got to know each other. We have some cool listeners. We have some great guests. And I kind of want to have everybody in one place, almost like a chat room. So we'll see how it goes. I talked about this last week with Weston Nordgren from CGM in the Cloud and the Night Scout Foundation. And after the interview, we talked off the air about it a little bit, and I decided to go for it. If it doesn't work out, no harm, no foul. We all go back to normal on Facebook. But if it does work out, I think it'd be a really neat way to connect. And at the very least, maybe get some more feedback about the show. So if you're on Facebook, please check it out. Again, I'll put it in the show notes. It's Diabetes Connections, the group, and I'd love to see you there. Okay. We've got lots of great stuff coming up as always. I could do this show every day. If I didn't have to have a life and, make dinner and drive people to school. But I'm kidding. But of course, there's so many great stories in the diabetes community. It's impossible to try to cram them all into this little show. But if you have a story, please let me know. You can always email me or reach out on social media. Thank you so much for listening for another week. Thank you as well to my editor, to John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. I sent him a jumble. He makes it a show, and I appreciate it each and every week. It's just great to have you here and to spend an hour with people who get it. I love it. I appreciate it so much. I'm Stacey Sims, and I'll see you back here next week.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.